It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, I didn't ask how to pronounce your last name.
Moschella.
Professor Melissa Moschella from the Catholic University of America, who's going to speak to us on vaccines, which, of course, has been on most of the world's mind in the last few years. Melissa is an associate professor of philosophy at CUA, where her teaching and research focus on natural law, biomedical ethics, and the moral and political status of the family. She's the author of the book To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Moschella speaks and writes on a variety of contemporary moral issues, including brain death, end-of-life ethics, parental rights, reproductive technologies, and conscience rights. Her articles have been published in scholarly journals as well as popular media outlets, including Bioethics, the Journal of Medical Ethics, Journal of Medicine, Philosophy, etc. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College, received a licentiate in philosophy summa cum laude from Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and received her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. And Dr. Moschella will now tell us about vaccines. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Chris mentioned, this is a topic that has really. No, this is a very sensitive keyboard. Okay, hold on. Yes, here we go. Wow, how far? Okay, here we go. All right. This is a topic that has really seen a resurgence in the past several years with the COVID-19 vaccines, which, as I'm sure probably all of you know, used cell lines which were originally derived from aborted fetal tissue in either development, production, and or testing of the vaccines. And this has led to a resurgence of debates about both the use of these cell lines, is it morally acceptable to use these cell lines in research, and debates about the moral acceptability of using products like vaccines made with the help of these cell lines. And I say resurgence because there was also a debate in the early 2000s about this with regard to the vaccines like the common rubella vaccine or the MMR combined vaccine or the chickenpox vaccines, which also used similar cell lines, not the same ones involved in the COVID vaccines, but cell lines that also were originally derived from aborted fetal tissue. So the cell lines at issue with the COVID vaccines are the HEC293 cell line, which was derived from the kidney tissue of a fetus aborted in 1972. It's not actually entirely clear in terms of the history whether that was an elective abortion or not. We're guessing that it was, but the historical record actually isn't clear, and records were not kept very clearly at that time. So we presume it was an elective abortion. Could have been a spontaneous abortion, although we don't know. And then there's the PER-C6 cell line, which was derived from the retina tissue of a fetus aborted in 1985. Oh, this must be on a timer, I see. So the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines used HEC293 for confirmatory lab tests of the vaccine, and then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine used the PER-C6 cell line in development, production, and testing of its vaccine. So some important facts to keep in mind as we think about this. So first, these are immortal cell lines, meaning that they reproduce indefinitely, so it's not that in using them you create a demand for more because they continue to reproduce themselves. And so using them does not create demand for new fetal tissue or new cell lines. And this is a really important contrast with the use of fresh fetal tissue in research, the kind of direct use of aborted fetal tissue, which would create a demand for more because that doesn't renew itself. So that, I think, is a very crucial distinction that's often not understood well, especially in the popular debates because most people don't really understand what cell lines are and how they differ from the direct use of fetal tissue. Then with regard to HEC293, which is the cell line I'll talk about the most, it is one of the most commonly used cell lines in basic science research. It accounts for about 85% of PubMed citations. And given the ubiquity of the use of this cell line in basic science, it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, to do research without at least using products that were made from HEC293, such as commonly used molecular reagents. And HEC293 is involved in some way in the development, production, or testing of countless products, including common over-the-counter medications, processed foods, and beauty products. So the cell line is pretty much everywhere in terms of it being used in some way or another in a lot of very common products. So the first question to think about, which is the answer to which is a lot less obvious than it's often supposed, is, well, why was it actually wrong to create the cell lines in the first place? So our objections to using the cell lines or to products that are made with their help is based on the idea that it was wrong to create the cell lines in the first place. So it's important to identify with clarity what exactly that wrong was. Now you might say, well, the wrong is that, hey, they came from aborted fetal tissue. Isn't that enough? Well, not exactly, because the decision to abort was an independent one. So in all of these cases, the abortion would have happened regardless of whether the tissue was subsequently used for research or not. So this is a kind of isolated decision that was made. That was obviously a seriously wrong decision, but had nothing to do with the later decision to use the tissue for research. And then the second thing to remember is it's not inherently wrong to use human mortal remains for research. That what's problematic here is not that we're using the remains of a deceased human being for research. We do that all the time in various contexts, or we scientists do that. I don't do lab research. But so the mere fact that these were human mortal remains that were used for research is not enough to explain why this is wrong. So I think if we want to identify the wrong with precision, there are a couple of things. First, that it's generally agreed upon that if we're going to use human tissue of any sort for research, we need to get proper consent from the person from whom the tissue was taken, or from a proxy or somebody authorized to speak on that person's behalf. And in these cases, there was no proper consent, even if the mother had consented to the use of aborted fetal tissue for research. The mother, who had decided to get the abortion and was therefore, morally responsible for the child's death, is obviously not in the right moral position to speak on behalf of the child. So in many of these cases, even especially the early cases, it's likely that no consent was obtained at all. But even if the mother had consented, that would not have been proper consent, because you need consent from somebody who can credibly say that their interests align with the child, and that just isn't the case in the situation of a mother choosing to abort her child. The second thing is that this is within a legal and cultural context that fails to recognize the dignity of the unborn. So you might say, well, it's one thing to use the mortal remains of some person who died with proper consent in a context where we understand that this is the mortal remains of a human being with dignity, and so we need to treat it with that kind of sense of respect. Arguably, given the current legal and cultural context surrounding abortion, often this human tissue is not really treated with the dignity that one ought to accord human tissue. And then The other concern in terms of why it was wrong to create the cell lines is that the researchers may have cooperated either materially or formally with abortion providers in order to procure the tissue. Now, this doesn't seem to have been the case for HEC 293 in terms of what we know about the history of that. It seems that the researchers who were given the tissue really had very little idea where it came from. So it's not that this was a situation where the researchers were kind of actively cooperating with abortionists in order to, have a relationship, ongoing relationship to get tissue that they could use for research. But with more recent cell lines, that is very likely the case, that the researchers, or at least the people in charge of the lab or procurement of biological materials for use in the lab, are likely to have this kind of ongoing relationship, probably a formal cooperation with the abortionists, which again makes the creation of the cell lines wrong. So what I want to emphasize here is that the evil of creating the cell lines is already one step removed from the evil of abortion, which is the primary concern. The use of the cell lines is then 2 steps removed from the evil, which is the primary concern. And the use of their products is 3 steps removed. So we're talking about steps removed in terms of human intentions and agency, which is what matters from a moral perspective. So, and the further you kind of go away from the original wrong choice, the more remote you are from the original wrong. And as we talk about moral frameworks in a minute, you'll see why it matters that the use of the cell lines and their products is several steps removed from the evils that we're concerned with here. So now the question is, well, is it permissible to use these cell lines in research or to use vaccines or other products that were made with the help of one of these cell lines? And to think through this, I want to take you through briefly a couple of moral frameworks. First, the cooperation with evil framework, which I'm going to run through briefly because I actually think in large part it doesn't apply here, even though it's often spoken of in terms of cooperation with evil, and then introduce a different framework. But before I talk about the frameworks, let me just add a kind of note of caution here. I think when we talk about moral frameworks like the cooperation with evil framework or the appropriation of evil framework, which I'll discuss in a second, we sometimes forget these are just frameworks, right? These are not bedrock moral principles. These are not dogma, right? These are kind of frameworks that ethicists have developed to help us think through what are the relevant moral concerns. So I say this because sometimes we kind of get too stuck on the framework and as if it were just a matter of kind of inputs and outputs in terms of determining the wrongness, where we actually have to understand, well, what are the relevant moral considerations? The framework is trying to capture that, but it's just a framework. So cooperation with evil, strictly speaking, is contributing to somebody else's evil action. Formal cooperation is contributing to the evil while sharing the evil intention, like hiring a hitman or giving your friend a gun to help him kill somebody. And since, as I'll emphasize a bit more later on, evil is a quality of choices, right? When your choice, your intention, your will is directed towards something that is morally wrong, well, that's always going to be wrong. So formal cooperation is always going to be problematic because your intention is evil, even if you're not the direct agent of the evil action. Material cooperation is when you're contributing to the evil, but you don't share the evil intention. Some examples would be buying from or investing in a company that uses unjust labor practices, working in a hospital that performs immoral procedures. These are all situations where you're contributing to the evil, but or don't have to at least be sharing in the evil intention. And the moral assessment here depends on, first, how direct is my contribution to the evil, and then, the more direct your contribution to the evil is, the stronger a proportionate reason you would need to justify making that contribution. And then there's also the consideration of, is my cooperation likely to cause scandal? And then there's an obligation to try to avoid that to the extent that that is a likelihood. So now I put a question mark here next to cooperation with evil, because I think that actually, strictly speaking, using the cell lines or related vaccines or other products made with these cell lines does not involve cooperation with evil, strictly speaking, because the evil, namely the abortion in the first place, and then the use of aborted fetal tissue without proper consent, and perhaps involving cooperation with abortion, those evils happened in the past. And there's nothing that we do today that can change the fact that those evils happened in the past. Now, some people argue that using the cell lines or their products does involve some indirect cooperation with evil insofar as you might be creating demand for more fetal tissue. But as an empirical matter, there doesn't seem to be any good evidence that using existing fetal cell lines actually creates any demand for making new cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissue. These cell lines do continue to be created, but they're not being created because there's a fear that the other ones are running out. When new cell lines are created, they're typically created because researchers are looking for a cell line with very particular properties in order that it's necessary for their particular research product, and the existing cell lines just don't have those properties. But in general, and this accounts for the near ubiquity of some of the earliest cell lines that were developed, like the HeLa cell line, the one derived from Henrietta Lacks, and the HEC293 cell line, because usually there's an advantage to using well-established cell lines with well-known properties. First, it's just easier to work with insofar as you kind of know the properties and how the cell lines are going to act, but also it's easier to get grants, it's easier to get FDA approvals, it's easier to get published because your research is easier to replicate, and so on and so forth. So usually all the incentives are to use the established cell lines unless you have some particular research question that can't be answered with those cell lines. So continuing to use the cell lines does not in and of itself create demand for more aborted fetal tissue. Now, even if it did, so some might say, well, just the mere willingness to continue to use these cell lines of morally questionable origin makes it more likely that companies are going to continue to derive cell lines from aborted fetal tissue, even if it's not a kind of direct link that you're creating demand. Still, the fact that we're not refusing to use those cell lines or their products means that companies have no incentive to try to find kind of alternative sources for the creation of new cell lines. So there might be some very remote indirect sense in which continuing to use the cell lines means that companies don't have any kind of strong disincentive to continuing to derive these cell lines from aborted fetal tissue. But again, that's very far removed and indirect and kind of speculative. And if you put the issue in perspective in terms of the daily cooperation with evil that is pretty much omnipresent in our lives to some extent. We live in a very morally complex world, and you just can't get away from it, right? Many of the common products that we buy were made with unjust labor practices of some sort, things like rice, coffee, roses, chocolate, clothing, carpets. it's nearly impossible to look into or even know fully the origins of every single product that you buy. Even the most scrupulous consumer, I think can't get away from some cooperation with evil in terms of products that you buy commonly on the market and the shelves of your local stores. Also, there are tons of companies that donate to Planned Parenthood, and so far as you buy their products, you are indirectly supporting their donations to Planned Parenthood, investing in any large index fund, the sort of things that our retirement accounts are often in without really us having any choice in the matter. Almost all of these have significant shares in companies that donate to Planned Parenthood or conduct research on human embryos or engage in other immoral practices. And then even paying taxes. Lots of our tax money goes to things that are clearly morally wrong. So we can't get away from this. And I would argue that probably all of these things are more direct cooperation with evil than the use of cell lines or products derived from those cell lines, if, as I said, there is even any cooperation with evil at all in the use of the cell lines, which there might not be. So I think a better framework for thinking about this is the framework of appropriation of the fruits of evil, which is a framework that is meant to help us think through the moral dangers of benefiting from past evil, and when it's permissible to benefit from past evil, despite those moral dangers. So the ethical concerns with appropriation in some ways mirror the ethical concerns with cooperation. So one concern with appropriation is that you might end up approving of the past evil from which you are benefiting. Because you're getting a benefit from this past evil, you might start to think, yeah, maybe it was okay that it happened. So much good came out of it, right? So just like formal cooperation in which you're sharing in the evil intention, here you're also in some sense sharing in the evil intention because you're approving of it. And so ratification of past evil would always be wrong. However, even if you're not ratifying the past evil, there can still be concerns with kind of risks to your character, concerns that your character might be corrupted, desensitized to the past evil, or that there might be a kind of seepage of the evil intention into your own character insofar as your ongoing benefit from this past evil might lessen the firmness of your moral opposition to it. And the level of risk here, I think, depends on several things. First, how close you are, again, in terms of intention, to the original injustice, and whether the benefit that you receive depends on the perpetuation of the injustice. So you might think of, for example, an undertaker who sets up shop in a neighborhood that has a very high violent crime rate, right? Now, that it could be perfectly legitimate to do this. These people do need somebody to take care of their dead for them, right? But there is a clear way in which the undertaker's business depends on people continuing to die at the current rate due to violent crime. And so this doesn't mean it's wrong to do it, but it means the undertaker in that scenario needs to be careful that he or she, doesn't actually start to want the crimes to happen so as to keep getting more of the bodies, right? So again, a kind of, gruesome, macabre example, but you get the idea, right? So this, again, none of this is to say that it's always wrong, but that you need to consider these things. And then there's also, just as in the cooperation framework, the concern with scandal. Will my appropriation be reasonably interpreted as implying ratification or approval of the past evil? And to the extent that appropriation does involve significant risks to moral character or likelihood of scandal, then a proportionate reason would be required to engage in it. But again, kind of recalling how ubiquitous this is, I think to the extent that you're relatively far removed from the original evil, I think the proportionality requirement vanishes basically to nothing in the sense that you're so far removed that the risks to your character are almost none. So you might think of some common cases like medical knowledge and treatments, many of which were originally derived from seriously unethical experiments, including things like, experiments done by the Nazis on those in concentration camps or in mental institutions. So we know, for instance, that the drug chloroquine used to treat malaria was derived from these Nazi experiments, and we still benefit from that knowledge. Right? We still kind of use the same knowledge to continue to produce the drug today. Retin A, used for mostly dermatological purposes, was developed with unethical experiments on prisoners. A lot of the knowledge that we have of human anatomy is because of unjust experiments done on people in concentration camps by the Nazis. Yet we use this to train medical students and so on. We think about land, right? How much of the land that we now use was unjustly taken from Native Americans. Most of the railroads in the south of the US were built by slaves, and yet we continue to use them. And buying almost any processed food or using probably almost any pharmaceutical product, most probably made use of HEC-293 or some other cell line of questionable origin at some stage, right, in kind of research, development, testing, and so on. So it is, as I said, basically impossible to avoid appropriation of the fruits of evil in your daily life. Now, in terms of applying the appropriation framework, I'm going to apply this to the vaccines and the cell lines, of course, but let me start with the chloroquine case because I think it's an interesting analogical case. So first, it's clear that you can use this drug yourself or dispense the drug as a doctor or even make the drug as part of a pharmaceutical company without ratifying the past evil. And I think that the risks to moral character are extremely low in this case. First, because you're very far removed from the original injustice. Again, not just in terms of time, which is not the crucial thing, but in terms of the kind of evil, how many steps you're removed from the evil intention. The use of the drugs or the information that we get from the Nazi experiments does not rely on the perpetuation of the injustice. So it happened, it's done. It doesn't need to continue to happen for us to be able to benefit from it. Also, at least in principle, the drug and the information used to create the drug could have been obtained without the injustice. That is another factor that makes it easier to maintain a kind of distance from it and avoid desensitization or kind of seepage, right, into your moral character. And so in a case like this, I think nothing prevents maintaining a condemnation of the original injustice despite benefiting from that original injustice. And I would argue that when it comes to both use of fetal cell lines and use of vaccines or other products made with the help of these cell lines, it's fairly similar to the chloroquine case. Certainly possible to use them without approving of the past evil. And I think for all the same reasons as the chloroquine case, the risks to moral character are extremely low. You're several steps removed from the original evil. Perpetuation of the injustice is not required for the benefit. In principle, cell lines could have been created in some other way, and if those just happened to be the commonly used cell lines, then those would be the ones that we were using. So it's a kind of historical accident, right, that HEC-293 is as ubiquitous as it is. It didn't have to be that way. So I think for all of these reasons, there's nothing in the case that makes it difficult at all to maintain a moral distance from the past evil. Now, one possible difference that some people have argued for in this case is that in a case like the chloroquine case, what we're concerned with is the use of information that was obtained through unjust experiments, whereas when we're talking about cell lines, there's a certain physical connection to the evil, and many have kind of made a lot of this to say, this is an important difference. But I don't actually see, from an ethical perspective, why it should matter that the connection is physical, because evil is a characteristic of choices and actions, not of physical things, right? So you'll often hear people speaking about, these cell lines as being morally compromised and things like that. And if they just mean that at the origins of these cell lines there were some immoral actions, well, fine. But a physical thing isn't really morally compromised, right? It's a human being and the choices and actions of human beings that are morally compromised. And what matters is how far removed you are from those immoral choices and actions, not how far removed you are from the physical thing. So what matters ethically is not physical proximity to the product of an evil action, but moral proximity of one's will to the evil choice. And again, many of the other analogous cases that I talked about involve physical proximity in some sense, right? The land unjustly taken is the same land. The railroads built by the slaves are the same railroads. And another case that is a hypothetical one, but could happen, is, you could imagine, say, that a baby is killed, is murdered, and then that you have a child in need of a heart transplant, and that baby was murdered in such a way that the heart could be available for transplantation. The parents of the baby, who had nothing to do with the murder, consent to allowing the baby's organs to be used for transplantation. I think there's clearly nothing inherently wrong with using that organ for transplantation, with accepting that organ for transplantation on behalf of, say, your child, if you were in that situation, even though clearly the availability of the organ comes directly from an injustice, and it doesn't get more physically continuous than it's the very heart, right, of the child that was killed, right? But what matters, again, in a case like that is the distance from the evil intention. There's no sense in which you are necessarily going to approve of the murder or desire that such murders be perpetuated merely because you happened to have received an organ transplant as a result of this terrible tragedy. So the next thing to think about in terms of applying the appropriation framework is the issue of scandal. And I think, here, in terms of the use of the cell lines in research, I think a lot of scandal surrounding this is due to just not understanding the difference between using, say, embryos or aborted fetal tissue in research on the one hand, and on the other hand, using historic fetal cell lines. The first two cases, the use of human embryos or aborted fetal tissue in research, these do create ongoing demand for the tissue, and so those are cooperation with evil and wrong. But the use of historic fetal cell lines, as I said, involve no cooperation with evil, or such remote cooperation with evil that it's less than many other commonly things that we do. And even as appropriation of evil are kind of several steps removed. And then similarly with the use of related vaccines, again, I think here the scandal is caused mostly by inaccurate or inexact claims. So, if you followed the debate as the COVID vaccines were being developed and released, you've got statements made by people saying that the vaccines are made with aborted fetal tissue, which is just simply false, right? Or that they contained, there were people that are sort of playing on the ick factor, right? That they contained actual, cells that came from these aborted fetuses. Again, false. But even if they did, that wouldn't actually be essential in terms of the ethical concern, just like the heart transplant from the murdered baby, right? So, but they don't, right? So these were all inaccurate claims. And I also think that in many cases, a refusal to be vaccinated on the grounds that these vaccines have some very, very indirect connection to this past evil may itself cause scandal of another sort, right? So I think in terms of scandal, it's just kind of a toss-up. But because the scandal from taking the vaccine seems to me to be pretty much entirely unreasonable based on misinformation and so on, I don't think there's really any worry with regard to scandal. But at the same time, in order to avoid that, we can try to promote ethical alternatives to research that use embryos or aborted fetal tissue, the kind of research that is morally problematic. And there are alternatives to that, the use of induced pluripotent stem cells, the use of fetal tissue from miscarriage, right, from spontaneous abortions, and so on. There could be other ways to get the tissue that's needed for research that doesn't involve cooperation with the abortion industry. And then finally, proportionality. I think that if the previous analysis is correct, to some extent, you may not even need a proportionate reason because you're so far removed from the evil. Right? So as I said, the risks to moral character are very low, very far removed from the original evil, and scandal is unreasonable and avoidable. When it comes to the benefits of the use of these cell lines, I think it's very clear that they are vast, both in terms of the scientific advances and the good that can be done through that research. And it's not that easy to substitute some other cell line, again, precisely because this is well known, easy to replicate, easy to get grants with, and so on. But also insofar as if all Catholic researchers try to opt out of this entirely, it could actually do harm insofar as Catholics will not be present as a pro-life witness in the profession to a certain extent, right? So I do think there are very important benefits to continuing to use HEC 293, and that in fact, if we stopped using it, we would have to create new cell lines, right? So, which in the current situation would most likely be new cell lines from aborted fetal tissue, which is exactly what we don't want. So I think it's more helpful to the pro-life cause to focus on protesting or proposing alternatives to the true ongoing injustices, namely the use of human embryos in research and the direct use of aborted fetal tissue in research. So just to sum up, the connection between the fetal cell lines and abortion is quite remote, and the connection between vaccines made with these cell lines and abortion is even more remote. Taking the vaccines or using the cell lines for research does not perpetuate abortion or even the lesser evil of using aborted fetal tissue for research. And so neither taking the vaccines nor using these fetal cell lines involve any cooperation with evil. And as I said, even if it did involve some very remote cooperation, it would be more remote than other common actions. And I think that pro-lifers can make better use of their limited resources on other fronts. And then finally, in terms of appropriation of evil, taking the vaccines or using these fetal cell lines doesn't imply approval of abortion or even of how the cell lines were created, nor does it involve any significant risk of desensitization to abortion. So I will stop there and open it up for questions.
Thank you.
Which button?
You might still use the slides, so we'll leave the lights as they are.
Okay.
Before we go to questions, one important reminder, restrooms are straight back in that hallway back there if you need. But thank you, Melissa. It's right on time, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. George.
So it seems like the two frameworks you talked about, the cooperation with evil and appropriation with evil, at least initially can be distinguished, that cooperation seems to emphasize ongoing things or present things, and appropriation focuses on the case of things that happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that these two frameworks can work kind of hand in hand to help us analyze different moral situations like what you presented here for these particular medical issues, can be applied in lots of other places as well. And I guess what's the best way to kind of evaluate when to think about it in the cooperation framework or the appropriation framework?
Right, that's a good question. So yeah, so as I said, these are frameworks that are broadly applicable, but also they're just frameworks. I mean, so what they're both trying to get at is first ensuring that you are not willing evil in any way, right? And then secondly, to the extent that you are causally connected to helping evil to occur, right, in terms of cooperation, ensuring that that causal connection is justified by the good that you are seeking to do. And let me clarify here, because that makes it sound like this cooperation framework, when you're talking about material cooperation only, is somehow a kind of ends justify the means thing. And it's not, right? So I think what's important to clarify here is that merely being somehow part of a causal chain that leads to evil, insofar as you're not willing the evil in any way, that action in itself is just not wrong, right? But then you have to have some consideration for the consequences of your action. So even if you're not willing potential bad consequences, it would be irresponsible as an agent not to consider potential bad consequences of your action. So anytime you're engaged in an action that is good in itself, but may have some potential bad consequences that you don't intend, then you have to consider, well, is it wrong to accept those bad consequences, even though I don't will them? Is it wrong to engage in the action despite knowing that these things are going to come out of it that are bad? And when you're thinking about that, you're really just applying different sorts of moral principles and norms. So there's one, basic moral principle, which is you should never intend evil, right? But then there are other principles that apply to accepting evil as a side effect of your actions. And those are principles like concerns about fairness, kind of captured in the golden rule, right? So are you kind of unfairly accepting bad side effects, right, in ways that disproportionately harm one group or person rather than another? Or are you kind of unreasonably prioritizing one good over another in cases where your action is aimed at some good but is going to harm some other good, right? So and I mean, if you think about like end of life decision making, I mean, it's all about this kind of thing. Do I continue with this treatment which is expensive, which is uncomfortable, which is burdensome in a variety of ways, which may have the benefit of extending life somewhat, but will have all these negative effects as well? Or do I decide that the burdens of the treatment outweigh the benefits in my particular case, or in the case of somebody that I have to make a decision for? And it's the same sort of thing, right? You have to make sure first that you're not willing the hastening of death. But then once you're sure of that, it really just becomes a matter of, well, is it unfair, or is it unreasonable to kind of prioritize one of these competing goods over another, right? And when it comes to the appropriation framework, again, the concerns here are the extent to which benefiting from the past evil can morally corrupt you insofar as can make you, in the end, less firm in your opposition to that evil, or even outright approve the evil. And so that's a matter of kind of introspection, if you will, as an agent, that we need to be aware of the moral effects of our action on our own character, and take steps to avoid that if we're in a situation where there is this danger of corruption, right? So this is the appropriation framework, I think, is more a matter of that inward awareness, and then taking steps inwardly to distance oneself from the evil, or to kind of check yourself, so am I doing anything that actually means that I want this evil to continue, right? And if so, then that gives you a reason to pause and say, maybe I need to stop, or at least need to change my attitude, right? So it's more of an internal thing with appropriation.
It seemed like that the argument about ubiquity seems to an argument to excuse ourselves. And the other thing is the fact that we are so many steps away is also a way to excuse ourselves. Because, for example, let's take Nike. Now, unfortunately, I'm wearing Nike shoes. You know, the first step is you bought the product. Second step is you provide your name to advertise the product. Or you buy the stock and benefit from it. And then one step removed is you buy the mutual fund that has have the stock of Nike. I mean, I guess using, and also if you look at Planned Parenthood and the list of people who contribute, what can I do? You know, you're hopeless, you find yourself hopeless. But is that a reason for excusing ourselves? I mean, that's a problem I have. You know, the point being is, for example, I could see an action where, all right, I can't boycott all these whole list of people that contribute to Planned Parenthood, but I could focus on one at a time and work with people to do it one at a time, and then if that one at a time effort is able to create a change in behavior, then maybe you could expand it to the next one. So sometimes, you know, we excuse ourselves too much.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the claim about ubiquity is not meant to be a kind of blanket excuse to just not be concerned about any of these things. But the claim is, I mean, it really goes back to also the answer to the previous question, which is what we're primarily concerned about when we're talking about morality is, am I willing evil in any way? And not am I unwittingly, indirectly causing evil in any way? Because the latter is literally impossible to avoid. Not merely because we live in a sinful, morally complex world, but also because you simply have to make choices between competing goods all the time. And so, you know, when it comes to a question of, okay, well, you know, should I buy the Nike tennis shoes or not, despite knowing that probably unjust labor practices went into these? Well, that's, I mean, you're thinking there entirely about a question of, well, where do I put my time and energy, right? So, and a lot of this is largely a matter of, I think, personal vocation, right? So it could be, you know, some particular person's vocation to kind of strongly protest all the evils of commercial society and go off and live in a completely self-subsistent way in the middle of nowhere, and write about it and provide a strong moral witness about the corruptions of our current society, right? But that's a very specific vocation. And there's a cost to that vocation, namely that you're not really going to be in the middle of the rest of messy society, influencing people, hopefully for the good through your relationships with them, influencing the structures of society from within because you are part of them and you have credibility within them, and doing all the other sorts of good things that you can do in another situation, right? So the amount, even just the amount of time and energy that one might spend trying to research every product that you could possibly buy, and so on. And that's time and energy that could be spent doing other things. And so this is all just a kind of analysis of, all right, as a matter of personal vocational discernment, where is God calling me to use my time and and energy, and does it make sense to use, however much time and energy worrying about these very, very, very indirect causal connections to evil, or is it better to use that time and energy and money also, because often buying different products means spending more money. Are those resources going to be better spent elsewhere? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think it really is a matter of kind of personal vocational discernment.
So I already have 5 questions in line. So Chris had a question earlier. No? Okay, then Brian is next.
Okay,
And we have about 5 more minutes.
so
for
this
questions.
hypothetical, but if there were a need there are occasions where you could create a new cell line that I believe might be morally acceptable, because at times, for protection of the life of the mother, the fetus or embryo has to be aborted. So in principle, you could use that aborted fetus or embryo to create a new cell line. Am I reading that right? That would be, you're not inspiring, and that very carefully constructed, you could move forward with that or not?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Just as you could use tissue from a spontaneous miscarriage. So yeah, or miscarriages. I mean, many women have miscarriages that don't complete naturally, and they need to be completed with a D&C, right? So you could use that tissue. So if there were, there just aren't, as to my knowledge, and all of this kind of concrete knowledge comes from Maureen, by the way. But there aren't, to my knowledge, sort of pipelines for that right now, because the pipelines are with the abortion providers, who are generally doing elective abortions, which are morally wrong, not medically necessary, life of the mother sorts of scenarios. But I think there wouldn't be a problem if
So
yeah.
you could move in that path.
Yes.
And be morally acceptable. And if you moved in that line, you would undermine the interest of using that material in aborted feces.
Right.
That's the wrong term. Incorrectly performed.
Right. Yes.
So I saw hands from Steve and Maureen.
So, when it comes to calculating the third order, fourth order consequences of some action, it's not just a question, it seems to me, of where you put your time and energy. When you're talking about remote consequences of something, the third and fourth order, the problem is you don't know all the consequences. Because when you get that remote, there are probably vast numbers of indirect consequences, and there's no point in trying to balance the way consequences at that level when you're unaware. You cannot be aware of most of them. So I don't think it's just time and energy. I think it becomes humanly impossible to do a moral calculation, weighing positive and negative consequences, when you cannot know all of them at that remote level.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important point that I forgot to mention. We are not consequentialists, right? So our job is not to create as much good as possible, in part because we simply can't control the consequences of our actions, right? What we control is what we choose. And we can try to ensure, insofar as possible, that what we choose is in line with what's genuinely good, and is seeking to promote the good. But the effects of that are beyond our control.
It's almost beyond our knowledge.
And beyond our knowledge, right? And so especially when you're getting, several steps removed and complex causal chains, even the Nike shoes, right? Would it, in current circumstances, is it better for the workers that those plants close or not? It's not entirely clear. I mean, they may be working in terrible conditions, and yet what are the alternatives realistically right now? It could be even worse if the plants closed all of a sudden, right? So it's not easy always to tell even what you should want to happen in these situations, because the consequences are very unpredictable.
Last question from Maureen.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask a question, I'm just going to make 2 observations. One, about things that might be better addressed in the discussion this afternoon. One feature that seems to be I mean, many, many people, I don't know about y'all, but I know dozens of people who refuse to be vaccinated. And the vast majority of them refused because it was repulsive. I mean, there's a famous example in this field of moral theology about Hitler's sweater. Would you wear a sweater that was Hitler's favorite sweater? And the vast majority of people refuse to do this. And people have done tons and tons of research on what could you do to purify the sweater. I mean, if you dry clean it, if you soaked it in alcohol, how could you remove Hitler from the sweater? Okay, if you exercised it, even if you let Mother Teresa wear it for a week or something. I mean, there's essentially nothing that can be done to the sweater to remove the repugnance because you're not objecting to the sweater, you're objecting to Hitler. Okay? I mean, I know moral theologians don't go to Germany. Ever. Because, and this raises the second point, because he found the Holocaust so repulsive. He feels a personal need to witness to that petition as a way of making a statement about what his beliefs are, sort of anti-scandalous, a statement about his virtues and values. So I think the notion of witness and I think the notion of repugnance are two very big elements of this whole discussion of vaccinations that are not adequately managed. Because I agree with people who refuse to be vaccinated and say, even though I'm 100% in agreement with Dr. Moschella, that there is no moral issue. They are providing witness to their repulsion to abortion. And I think that's up.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I actually wrote a brief article that was a kind of dialogue with somebody on the moral repugnance issue. And I think it's complex, I think partially because repugnance is a feeling, and feelings need to be educated by reason. And so the mere fact that we feel repugnance at something is not sufficient to tell us that it's morally wrong. And that's why I think we need to do the reasonable kind of analysis to say, well, we need to educate our feelings. The mere fact that this has some physical connection to something morally wrong actually doesn't give us any reason to avoid association with it, right? But even though there's that feeling, right, the kind of ick factor, as I said before. So yes, thank you for that.
Thank you. In the interest of time, you look very eager, so. Final question while I change slides to the next speaker. Go ahead.
You mentioned research into other means of creating vaccines. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
What do you mean, other means of?
Without using fetal tissue. Is there research into other areas where you can create vaccines? I mean, I heard the word hoard of fetal tissue many times. And is there research into other means?
Yes, I mean, vaccines, there are many vaccines that have no connection at all to aborted fetal tissue or to any of these cell lines. Yeah, the great majority. Yeah, so it's, so not just research, they actually are happening and on the market. So, and even some of the COVID vaccines, just not the ones that are available here in the US. So yeah, so that is certainly happening. But everywhere. Yeah, including here. Most of the US-based vaccines are not made with these cell lines.
I think what you're asking is you're asking a question that doesn't reflect the reality of vaccine research. You're asking, is there a research institution, university, that's saying, we will not use HEC-293 cells. We are actually trying to develop a morally acceptable, I think all of vaccine production is driven predominantly by pharmaceutical companies and it's driven predominantly by economics. So if it's cheaper to make a vaccine, for example, in a chicken egg, which is a huge number of vaccines that are made in chicken eggs, because they're cheap, because it's fast, because it's been well validated, it doesn't cause disease for other people. So we do it that way if the chicken egg is capable of making a vaccine. So I don't think there's a concerted research effort to try to find ethically superior alternatives. There's a strong economic effort to find the cheapest, fastest, easiest possible way of doing it. And that has resulted in many, many vaccines that have nothing to do with this.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Marty.
With that, let's thank Professor Moschella.